Welcome back to Shifting Schools. I'm so excited to bring you today's episode where I get to sit down and talk to Peter Stiepleman, the 2021 Missouri Superintendent of the Year. He is now a full-time consultant. He's just released a book called The Imperfect Leader. His website is all about human-centered leadership, and he's also got a podcast by the same name, An Imperfect Leader. In today's episode, we talk, you're going to guess it, about leadership, about school leadership at all levels. Peter really focuses in on this idea of how do we become a human-centered leadership models? What does that mean for schools? What does that mean for an organization? And you get to walk away with some tips around what he calls is the 3-pillar approach to a transformational model. And these 3 entry points are collective aspiration, nested patterns, and leaders learning work. He explains more about that in our podcast. It's such a great episode of in-depth learning, and you're going to want to check out his podcast, An Imperfect Leader. We talk about that as well. This is a fantastic one. If you are in any leadership role, from coaching to educator in your classroom where you are a leader, all the way up to school board members and superintendents, we cover it all in this episode of Shifting Schools. And with that, on with the show. All right, welcome back to Shifting Schools. I'm excited to be here with Peter Stiepleman, the 2021 Missouri Superintendent of the Year. Congratulations on that, Peter.
You know, I appreciate you saying that because the announcement and the award ceremony was done in my conference room with everybody 6 feet apart from each other. Because it was the height of the pandemic, and so it was like, we're here to recognize. And so, thank you, I appreciate that.
Yeah. Peter has a book out called An Imperfect Leader. He runs the website Human-Centered Leaders and has a podcast, An Imperfect Leader. Peter, give us a little bit about your background and kind of what you're doing today.
Yeah, so I'm a retired superintendent who has sort of shifted into advising and consulting. And but before that, I was a superintendent in Columbia, Missouri, in the Midwest, 4th largest district in the state. And before that, sort of followed your traditional path of a teacher and a principal and then central office. Before I was in Columbia, Missouri, I was in Oakland, California as a teacher and an administrator. And before that, I was an insurance agent. So that was kind of a very quick and abrupt shift when I realized it's not what I wanted to be doing.
And all of a sudden you found your educational path, and
exactly.
The rest
it was one of those like drop everything and read days. And so I went into a classroom and read a book that my in-laws had written called the Beggar's Magic. And it was like, it was a transformational moment, sort of like looking at these kids who were sort of wide-eyed and totally into the story and asking you a million questions. And I went back to my cubicle and said, this is not really where I want to be.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, I want to get started today with our conversation around your website is titled Human-Centered Leaders, and talk a little bit about what is a human-centered leadership approach? How do you emphasize the value of people first? And could you maybe elaborate on how this philosophy differs from maybe a traditional top-down leadership model as it impacts organizational culture?
Yeah, I really appreciate the question. I think, first of all, it's important to recognize that there's a difference between reform and transformation. And so many of our schools and school districts across the nation have adopted a real reform sort of movement. And reform is really about changing, allowing external forces to change what's happening in your system. And so it sort of focuses on what's going wrong, right? We got to fix something, and it's giving orders, and it's coaching for compliance. And it's a lot of high pressure. And so those who are listening right now are probably feeling uneasy because reform is what that makes us all feel. It's just sort of this high anxiety and frustration. Transformation, and human-centered transformation in particular, is very different. It says, what do we want to create together? So it starts with this sort of collective aspiration and creating that shared purpose. And then it sort of says, well, let's not look at what's not going well. Let's look at it through a more appreciative lens. What's going well, and how do we get more of it? And then let's use curiosity and innovation sort of questions and inquiry to sort of gauge and sort of guide us towards where we want to be. you have these cycles of inquiry and saying, if it's going well, great. If it's not going well, let's evaluate, make some mid-course corrections. And instead of coaching for compliance, let's do peer coaching where we share the load together and learn from each other and then redefine the goal if that's necessary. So human-centered leadership is all about, the people in your organization, not process necessarily. And so for me, it's sort of the antithesis of what Frederick Taylor came with when he designed schools and factories. And, the only institutions that are still following Frederick Taylor's sort of efficiency model are prisons and schools. Mm-hmm. And so what I wanted to do is really rethink that and engage in high levels of collaboration and shared leadership and this notion of harvesting the collective wisdom of the people in your organization, leaders at every level. So it's somewhat dismantling the hierarchy, recognizing there has to be one in certain circumstances. But when you're making decisions, making them together.
And I love this idea of talking about reform versus transformation, because just as you're saying that, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, that's all I'm hearing in the news is we've got learning loss due to COVID and our math scores are down. And it's automatically putting our frame set into this. We've got to do something to, like, the wheels are falling off. How do we fix it? Right. And what you read and what you hear all the time is we've got to fix things. We've got to fix things. We've got to fix things. And that puts you into a mindset of anxiousness, a mindset of, I don't know what to do, or I don't know how to fix it. I don't know how we got here. Right. Versus that transformational human-centered approach of what do we want to do together?
Yes. And how do we want to be together? Right. I mean, so this notion of like establishing some protocols and behaviors and habits that we'll do together. And I think you bring something up that's pretty important, which is that, and having worked in a metropolitan district in Oakland, California, we were constantly being approached with external forces telling us about how they're going to fix our teaching, how they're going to fix our kids. And it's so problematic to not have trust in the professionals in your system to say, no, we recognize that there was learning loss. We recognize that there are issues in terms of kids being able to collaborate well together and be able to talk to each other because they've had to be thrust into, technology only as opposed to technology assisted. And so let's do this work together as opposed to, allowing someone else to tell us, here's your silver bullet. It has never worked over 100 years, but all of a sudden now it's going to work.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, it's so true. And I think this is one of the things I talk about a lot when I'm consulting, and I'm sure you do too, is education is it's the hardest thing to try to change because everybody's gone through it. In America, everybody's gone through it. Whether you were successful or not, we can debate that all day, but everyone has an experience, right, of this educational system. And so when we're trying to make transformational moves, it's really difficult because everybody remembers their experience and then that experience, and everyone had one, whether it was good or bad, everyone had that experience. And one of the things that I like is, through your website and your book, An Imperfect Leader, you talk about building strong partnerships and you advocate for strong partnerships between leaders, school boards, and the larger community. What strategies do you maybe recommend for developing and maintaining these very crucial partnerships, especially in the era we find ourselves in right now?
Yeah, you bring up something that I think is interesting. There's a difference between complicated and complex. And when we say things like, well, it's not rocket science, we're like, yeah, I know. Schools are more complex than that, right? There's no one answer, even if it's a difficult way to get there. Complex is there is no right answer necessarily. And you're constantly trying different ways to get at what you're trying to achieve. And so building partnerships is a big part of that. And I like to use metaphor, and I think of schools as like an organism. And in order for an organism to thrive, like its internal structures, its systems, its habits, they have to be really healthy. And the external systems outside that are sort of influencing the school district or a school system or a school in particular, they have to be healthy as well in terms of being able to support and nurture that system. So. So you asked about like some strategies. Before I tell you a strategy, I'd like to suggest maybe some habits or at least some ways of thinking about things. So obviously constant communication, right? But clarity, not transparency. That's one that I learned from Avis Williams, wildly and brilliant superintendent in New Orleans. And she taught me two things. Well, she taught me many things, but two things that really stuck out. One is clarity versus transparency. She says that not everybody wants to know every detail that went into making a decision, but they want clarity to know that you're really clear on the why, and that there are some really some of the details are made really abundantly clear. So clarity versus transparency. And the other is that if you can buy into something, you can be bought out. So she talks about commitment instead of buying into something. So for me, it's like, oh, and then a third for me is seeking advice, not feedback. So during the pandemic, we were constantly asking for feedback, which was misinterpreted as asking for a vote. And so when we would ask about, give us some feedback about your thoughts on masks, or give us your feedback about our return plan, it became this vote, and then this sort of chorus that said, we voted for this. And my thought was, oh no, I was asking for advice, because I'm also seeking advice from virologists and pediatric infectious disease experts and the health department that is also offering some really important advice. So to get back to your question about building stronger partnerships, first, I think that language matters and those types of things. And then the second piece for me is really engaging in things like a World Cafe, because you're seeking advice. You're bringing people together, and you're asking a very big question, and you don't ask many. You just ask for one big question. And individuals are sitting at different tables and sort of wrestling with that question and writing their thoughts down on paper and talking with their people at their table. Sometimes it's really wise to have students and teachers and school board members be facilitators, so that they're really quietly listening to what the community is saying. They'll have their time and their opportunity to give their feedback or their advice as well. And then you ask them to change tables, so they get to hear from different perspectives. And then you collect all that information, and then you say, before we're going to share this out with others, we're going to then make sure that we really consider the perspectives that are not seated here today, because you make decisions with the people most impacted by that decision. And so if in fact you're talking about, closing a school, well, you have to make sure that you're engaging so many different parts of your community and your system before you actually release or reveal some of your thoughts about moving forward. And so I say a World Cafe is a super important one. And then since you, I know you are somebody that all across the nation, we seek your counsel and your expertise around technology. There's a tool called Thought Exchange that I've used and is amazing, because what it allows you to do, it uses Bayesian averages to sort of eliminate the loud voice and elevate really what your community is saying. And then using AI, something I know that you are really at the forefront and leading, that it uses AI to sort of mine the information about what people are saying. And then it gives you information about potentially two different camps. This group thinks this thing, this group thinks this way. And it allows you to then say, but here's what they have in common. Here's where they have common ground. And for a leader, it allows you to then say, okay, through all this cacophony, I'm going to sort of delve into and look for where there's common ground. And I'm going to start there, because that's going to build for me the most, the greatest partnerships and allow me to lead.
I love that. Build from a common ground. I think that's such great advice for leaders at all levels. I think a lot of what I'm hearing and seeing in schools that I visit is just the stress that teachers are under, that stress that school leaders are under. There's just a lot of stress in the system right now. And I think that idea of how do we find what common ground is and build from there, rather than where we usually end up, and where it feels like a lot of times, is we end up on two opposite ends of a spectrum, and you're trying to navigate, negotiate, pick your word of what you're trying to do.
Yeah. Well, you think about those beginning of the year meetings, and there's such excitement and optimism, and you do engage in sort of this collective aspiration. What do we want to create together? What are we going to do this year? And by the time November comes, you're looking back and you're like, what were we talking about? God, I'm exhausted, right? And then February is like the darkest month. And it's like, don't even mention those back to school meetings. And then May comes and you want to sort of come back together and say, look at what we achieved. And everyone's just like, I would rather do something else, And so how do you find that common ground and then have these cycles of inquiry to celebrate what you have achieved and recognize like we are marching towards something really great together? And to your point, the pandemic has forced us into this. We're burnt out. I mean, across the nation.
Yeah.
If I went to visit some schools last week in the Bay Area, in South Bay and Silicon Valley, most notably because I was really interested to see these are schools that adopted a no cell phone policy. And so I was kind of interested to see how, what are teachers saying? What are kids saying in terms of being able to maximize their learning? And to your point, though, there is this sort of low hum of we're really tired. And they haven't fully reset to say, what do we want to create together? How do we want to be together? Establish a compelling purpose.
Did they find anything about the cell phones on a separate note?
Well, yes. So it's interesting. I asked some eighth graders, tell me a little bit about the cell phones. And they said, well, we're not allowed to have them. I said, what do you think about that? And I said, what's good about it? He goes, we hate it. I said, okay, I'm going to get to what do you hate about it? what do you like about it? And it was, very simple. Like, well, I'm able to hold on to my phone because in this case, this is a school that adopted a program by Yonder. And so they have these pouches, they put them in and they get to maintain possession, which is pretty cool. I said, okay, what don't you like about it? Well, I'm not allowed to have my phone and I want to have my phone. I said, so you're eighth graders? Yes. Your school started doing this when you were in sixth grade? Yes. What was sixth grade like? Oh, it was terrible. Kids were always arguing with teachers. Kids were recording fights. Kids were nonstop on their phones. Our parents were texting us. So we didn't know whether or not we should answer our phone and, answer our parent who's texting or get in trouble with our teacher. And now we don't have that. I said, so it sounds like you can learn more. And they said, well, yeah. I said, so it doesn't sound so bad. And he goes, no, it's not that bad. Kids are pretty honest. They don't like the fact that they don't have possession, fully. But they also recognize that nobody does. Everybody is participating. And I was in the lunchroom. And that was the best because it reminded me of the days when I was an elementary school principal where we would say to kids, you're at a level 5, it's so loud in here. You're at a level 5. We need you back at a level 2. And that's what it was in this cafeteria. Kids were talking to each other, laughing, joking. Yeah. They weren't on their phones. And that was pretty neat.
Yeah. That's cool. That's very cool. Well, that's awesome. We could do a whole nother podcast just on that. For sure.
I'm all on it.
Yeah. One of the things over on your website and a lot of the stuff you talk about is the transformational model, your human-centered school transformation model.
Yeah.
And it includes 3 entry points. You have your collective aspiration, your nestled patterns, and leaders learning work. Can maybe explain a little bit about these different components and how do they work together to deepen the culture of learning in a school?
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate it. My mentor, Linda Henke, created this model, and I now get to be the beneficiary of it. And my hope is to be able to share it with others because, when I was a superintendent, I led through relationship mostly, and particularly in those early years, sort of made decisions intuitively. And it wasn't until I learned about this model that I had something really to anchor myself to. So research backed in the sense of, things like a growth mindset in Carol Dweck's work or compelling purpose and systems thinking is like Peter Senge's work. And so, so this model starts with sort of at the core is what you want in all of our schools is deeper learning, but deeper leading and deeper learning. And deeper learning really speaks to the teacher serving as that activator of knowledge and doing project-based or place-based learning where kids are able to follow what they're curious about, something that is tied to their community and be able to then learn about it and then talk about it in a meaningful way that's, that they're learning their standards, but in a way that makes sense to them and is relevant. And so that's at the center. And then there are 3 ways to get in there as you described. And sometimes I describe it about like they serve as like trailheads when you go camping. And I only laugh because I grew up on Long Island. I didn't do a lot of camping. And then when I started dating now my wife, she wanted to go camping all the time. And we would like wake up and all of our food would have been eaten. She'd say like, oh my God, I had a terrible dream that all of our food was eaten. And then of course it all had been eaten. So maybe trailheads is not the best image. But collective aspiration, you can enter anywhere on this to get to deeper learning. Collective aspiration is really like the heart of the work that we do. So it does ask for you to kind of consider your compelling purpose. Why do we exist and what are we trying to achieve for children? And how do we make sure that we're all on the same page for that? And then nested patterns is really the muscle of the work. So it really speaks to the habits that we practice as an organization. So how do we want to be together? So that high levels of collaboration and shared leadership and empathy and compassion. Creativity and curiosity speaks to like innovation. And then the last is that leaders learning work, which speaks to the mind of the work. And so that we serve as lead learners, which is really Brene Brown's work on being vulnerable. So admit when you've made a mistake, make a mid-course correction, and move together, move on. But it also means learning alongside your people. So you do so many trainings and workshops, and you work not just one-offs, but do over time with schools, which I think is so important. And I'm sure you notice when you're doing that work, if the leader has just sent a team of teachers, go do that work. That's important work. You go do it. That doesn't become enduring change or transformation within their system. So when they're doing that work with their teachers alongside, that's pretty magical. So the leaders learning work is about serving as a lead learner, but then also applying systems thinking to that work. So really recognizing, I'm going to make this decision. And there's possibly going to be a delay between making the decision and getting the results I want. So how are we going to manage that tension? And so having those conversations about systems thinking. If you ever want to learn more about systems thinking in particular and in schools, the Water Center for Systems Thinking is like a magnificent resource for school leaders and teachers.
That's great. You have to send me that link. We'll make sure we put that in the show notes.
They're really amazing.
Yeah, that'd be great. And I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, the amount of trainings that we've done through the years, when we do a long-term or when I do a long-term contract with school districts, one of the things I always include is the school leaders need to be going through the training with the teachers. Yes. And of course, I mean, as a consultant, I can say it all day. Whether or not the leaders actually show up says so much about the organization. And to your point, in the school districts where I've had a 3 or 5 year long relationship with, and the either principal or superintendent or, assistant superintendent of teaching and learning, they are in every single training. They are there with the teachers. They are hearing the conversations. They are asking for advice. They are able to put out the plans. Those districts every single time move faster, are more smoother in transition. They just versus districts, and I've had quite a few of them where the principal just doesn't have time to come, or they're not making it a priority, or there isn't any leadership. And so I end up with a group of teachers who are asking questions of the district. And of course, I can't answer them because I'm not part of the district, and there's nobody there to support them in, okay, we're learning to do this. We're learning project-based learning, or we're learning, a hybrid approach to teaching and learning with online courses. What does this mean for us as a school? And they're not in the conversation in the moment. And it's so, so critical when you're trying to create transformational change that you have to be in it as a community. From leaders, from leaders at every level all the way down. It's just incredible how the difference I've seen.
Clapping and I'm looking for the emoji for celebration. Yeah, you're so right. And there's such a difference between the districts where everybody is doing that work together and those who are just sent to go, and they call it, we're doing train the trainer. No, you're not.
No. Yeah. And I mean, just now reflecting on it, I mean, I've got the districts that I have the most success with wasn't anything because of what I was doing as a consultant. It was because of the leadership at that district.
Yeah. Well, you were serving as an activator. I mean, that's deeper learning, right?
Yeah.
You could call it facilitator, but I think it's deeper than that. You weren't just facilitating conversation. You are an expert, and you're then activating for them what this could look like for them. Because it's true, most districts are very similar, but there are some pieces that are distinct in every community. And so you're serving as an activator.
Yeah, I love that. We're having a conversation here with Peter Stiepleman, who've also written a book, An Imperfect Leader. Talk a little bit about the book. What was the inspiration behind it, and where could people go and maybe get a copy?
Yeah, so my superintendency ended in 2021. I had indicated to my board in 2019 that I was going to be moving out of Missouri, and so I moved to the Pacific Northwest, and that was always our plan. And of course, the pandemic hit, and they're like, "Are you sure you want to leave?" I was like, "Yeah, I'm good. I'm good. I got us through. I got us back in seat.
Yeah,
take care now." And so I really wanted to process what I had learned, everything from this model of a human-centered school transformational model. I wanted to be able to think about and talk about systems thinking, everything I'd learned or was learning through that work. And then I wanted to apply an after-action review process, which is something that is somewhat foreign to school leaders, although, to some extent we do this. We say, that went well, or that didn't go so well, or this is what I would probably do differently in the future. But I wanted a very structured approach in this book to sort of look at one big issue from each of my 7 years as a superintendent and sort of look back on them and say, okay, so what got overlooked, and what did I learn about relationships, and what frustrated me, and what could I have done differently? And also in the end, because I learned so much through this experience, what was something that was good that came out of it? And so my publisher wouldn't let me write it as a memoir. So it's about a superintendent, but it's me. So you're like, if you're a reader going, God, every chapter is a guy, yeah, well, it's me. So, and there's a distinction between imperfect and incompetent. So I recognize that I'm being incredibly vulnerable by just highlighting something that just didn't go so well in each of those years. And the goal was somewhat to be like, somewhat cathartic for me to sort of relive and to sort of reflect on what happened, but also to try to have an impact on those who are aspiring to be school or district leaders, those who are becoming school board members and trying to understand how superintendents think and the different ways that they interact within their system and the external system, because in many ways, you're a politician as well as a CEO, as well as a lead learner. And so I wanted to have an impact on those who are aspiring, those who are new to the profession, and then those who have been doing it for some time, to know that they're not alone in some of their experiences. So I talked about big issues that most superintendents, will face. Everything from there's a chapter about LGBTQ plus community within the schools, the Gay Straight Alliance wanting to put up posters in a school, and how that went well in some areas and didn't go so well in other areas. And how did you sort of navigate a conservative community? That's an important piece right now in our country to sort of figure out and navigate. And so I share some lessons learned, what went well, what didn't go so well, or how do you bring values to your organization? And so I brought these values, and I thought, these are really great values. And then things weren't going so well within the organization. And I remember leaning on a principal and saying, we've got these values. And she said, no, those are your values. They're not our values. I was like, oh my God. So how do you go through a process of saying, how do we want to be together, right? What are our values as an organization? And boy, I'm so glad that we did that work, because during the pandemic, they were essential. They buoyed us when things were really rough.
I love that. And people can get the book anywhere.
I suppose. Anywhere. Anywhere, everywhere. Amazon and Barnes and Noble. And when I'm feeling like, does anyone care about the book? I look and see like, oh, well, you can get it anywhere. So An Imperfect Leader, human-centered leadership in after action, because it's really about looking back. Hospitals and the military do this regularly. And I really think that superintendents, if they gave themselves just a little bit of time to do this with their teams, would make much more predictably successcul decisions.
Now, on top of that, you've started the podcast by the same name, An Imperfect Leader.
Right.
Talk a little bit about it, because and
really creative.
We had the same conversation for your podcast as we're doing podcast swaps here. Yeah. So appreciate that. And I had somebody who listens to your podcast, and they said, I can't wait to listen to that episode, because Peter's podcast is all about, looking back and reflecting on you as a leader and something that you did. And Jeff, you're all about the future and where are we going? They said,
exactly. Well, I think, when our episode airs, the one where you were on my podcast, I think I declared you're a futurist. Meanwhile, I do a retrospective. What did you learn? And you're saying that's interesting and important, because it'll certainly help me think about where I am right now. Yeah. And now I take people to look where we're going. And that's pretty cool.
Well, and I really appreciate it. And I'd like you to talk about the format of your podcast, because as someone that was on the interviewer or interviewee side of it, I really appreciated the thoughtfulness of being reflective. And maybe talk about that. Just like, what's the premise and how you set up the show?
So the premise is similar to how I described the book. And what I do is there are really amazing leaders all over our country that I either find out about or read about. And I reach out to them and say, I wonder if we could talk about the article you wrote or the work that you're doing. And so that's the first part of the episode, is just to sort of learn about that leader and the way that they think. And then the second part is to ask them to do exactly what I did in the book, which is to reflect on a decision they made and what did they learn about it. And I interject from time to time to say, so what got overlooked? Or if I understand correctly, it sounds like this is what happened. And sometimes I say, yes, you're exactly right. Or no, that's not exactly what I was thinking, which is helpful because it clarifies for them what were they thinking at that moment. And so there have been some great episodes with with individuals who really talk about what they've learned and in some cases how they lost their job and moved to another one based on a decision that they made. And so some of them are really personal, and I'm grateful that they're willing to share their stories with a community. If you were to ask me, like, why you did the book, why do you need a podcast? For me, I started to think about how do we impact leader longevity? So nationwide, and I'm sure you've seen this, you've started a contract with a district only to finish your contract with a different superintendent in place.
Yeah.
Because the national average for superintendents is 3 years. And then if you're a woman or a leader of color, it's about 2 years. And so what I wanted to do was have some type of positive impact on leader longevity. Let us hear from people in the field who look like you, who may have walked in similar shoes, who may not look like you and may have had different experiences, and what we might each learn from their experiences as we're confronted with those decisions. So there's like in Hartford, Connecticut, Leslie Torres Rodriguez talks about closing a school and how deeply personal that was because she grew up in that school district. Yeah. She went to the Hartford Public Schools and now was having to talk to her community about declining enrollment and having to close a school and being able to tell the story about what that might mean for improved programming, even though that's really hard to lose your neighborhood school. There are districts all across America right now faced with those types of decisions that just listening to that podcast episode might give them some ideas on how to harvest the wisdom of their community and who they might be, missing in the conversation.
For a new listener who maybe is quickly pulling up their Spotify or Apple podcast app
and Apple,
looking
for 5 stars, please.
Yeah, getting An Imperfect Leader all lined up. Do you have an episode that you recommend that you're like, man, if you had to start with one episode on my podcast, here's one that I would recommend, this one by this person, or is there one that comes to mind that you're like, this would be your one to get started?
I would say it depends on what, I would push back a little bit to say, like, you might be a leader who's thinking, oh my God, we made a bad hire. And now I don't know what to do about that. And so, or how do I avoid, I'm about to hire someone, but my spidey senses or a little red flag is saying, I'm not totally sure this is the right person. Should I wait? And so like Brent Elliott in Washington, DC, Dr. Elliott would say, you should probably wait. And if you're a district that's saying, look, we're probably going to go out for a bond or a tax increase to build some buildings. And I really want to kind of think that through. Mike Redmond in Minnesota, it would be a great episode. Sharonica Harden is in University City in Missouri and outside of St. Louis. And she would say, yes, there's a sense of urgency as you're coming into the position that you want to do really well. But really resist the urge to be impulsive by saying things like, we don't do that, or why don't we do that? Or, to really get a beat on the system before you make a decision. Yeah. But my favorite episode still, I think, because it's just so wild, is Nate Levinson was a superintendent outside of Boston in a town and gown community, right? So half the community belonged to different faculties of all the different prestigious universities in the Boston area, and other half of the town had been there. Their roots run deep. They're not affiliated with higher ed. And the board was mostly made up of university folks. And 5 out of the 6 or 6 out of the 7 of the board members said, we have a real problem with the crossing guards here. They don't come out of their cars when it rains. They don't even show up when it snows, and they're not even monitoring the most dangerous crosswalks. And so he had someone come do a traffic study, and they came and looked, and they said, Nate, your crossing guards don't get out of the cars when it rains, and we were there on snow days. They're not even showing up. And you know what? they're not really at the most dangerous crosswalk. So he gave a presentation to the board, and the board voted on his recommendation to eliminate the crossing guards. I think it would have saved the district maybe $60,000. And he said within just a few months, he was fired.
Oh, wow.
He said it didn't matter that he had closed achievement gaps between special education students and general education students. It didn't matter that he increased graduation rates or that he improved achievement. It is now the only, as far as we know, unionized crossing guard unit in the entire nation, because so the lesson learned was really get a beat on your system and really learn what is important to a community. Because could you imagine the drumbeat at the board meetings where our kids are going to die, or I've known this crossing guard since I was a child. She walked me across, right? So, so these are compelling stories that our leaders across the nation are telling, mostly because they want to have be a resource to the field.
Awesome. I love that. Those are some great recommendations. Again, you can find his podcast, Peter Stiepleman's podcast, An Imperfect Leader, book by the same name. Website is Human-Centered Leadership. We will have links to all of that over in the show notes. Peter, thank you so much for taking time today. Are there any other places you want people to reach out and maybe connect with you? Where do you spend your time on social media, or is it a good place for people to contact you?
Yeah. So I'm regularly on LinkedIn, sort of, giving my thoughts on things, from time to time on Twitter. And I am on Instagram sometimes when I visit a school or there's something, a small clip that I really want to share that I've heard something that I thought might entice you or at least inspire you to think differently about school. So you can find me in some of those social media areas. PeterStiepleman.com is my website. And, but please, I'd love to hear what you think about the podcast. So if you listen and have some thoughts, would love for you to leave a review.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Peter. Appreciate it. It's so great even to be able to interview somebody in my own backyard. We're only a ferry ride apart.
That's right.
People here in Seattle might know, just across the way, Peter lives over on Bainbridge Island. So we're very close to each other. So it's great. Time zones match up and it makes it very easy.
Yeah, come play
Peter, thank you.
I'll come over there and
That's great. Thank you so much for your time today, my friend. I appreciate it.
Appreciate you, Jeff.